So now that I have both of my eyes done, I can go in and I can work on my eyebrows and my eyeliner. I'm going to do my eyebrows first. I personally hate putting on eyeliner, so I usually kind of avoid that, right, for as long as possible. So for my eyebrows, I personally like to use a pencil. I know that in the Ben Nye kits that you all have, you should all have some kind of an eyebrow pencil in there. You always want to make sure that that's sharpened before you use it, because if it's too dull, sometimes it can even kind of like scratch your skin and you're not going to be able to get the kind of definition that you're probably looking for. Um, so in order to do your brows, you kind of have to think about like what brow shape is going to look good on your face or your actor's face, but you also do need to think about like the time period that you're in. So for the 40s, it was like a little bit more of like a natural eyebrow shape that people had. It's like a little bit more rounded. But in the 50s, you start to see, not necessarily for every person in the period, but you do start to see the brows be a little bit more defined. And a lot of times they even like angled upwards a little bit. I don't know how much my brows are going to let me do that, but I will certainly try to get that effect for you all. But it's something that you can probably see a little bit more clearly in research photos, or if I blocked out like the end of my brow, I'd be able to kind of like draw that up. But a lot of times for makeup for stage, again, it's more of that interpretation of the period, so it's like the essence of the period without taking it super literally, because sometimes things that were done in the older time periods are not necessarily the most flattering on every single person. So you always have to take into account kind of who you're working on, the situation that you're working in, and you really just want to make sure that everybody looks as good as possible when they're on stage, because that is usually everybody's ultimate goal, right? So just like any other time when I've done brows in class with you all, the way that I was always taught to do them is that you want to start in the center of your brow, right? And then that way the ends don't get too thick, so I always start a little bit in the center. So my eyebrows are they're kind of different, right? Like I don't really have any hair right here, so regardless of what the time period is, I always have to draw that in. So that's why I'm saying like there might be specific looks that are better for certain time periods, but you also have to take into account who you're working on, right? Like I have no eyebrow hair right here, so regardless of if it's the 1920s or like 2020, whatever it is that you're doing, I have to draw hair in there, or else I'm gonna look crazy, right? So you always have to kind of take that into account. So I'm just gonna try to get like my natural shape in there, and then we'll kind of go from there. So we can do this one where it's like a little bit more 1940. So this one I'm just gonna go more with like what my normal brow shape is and just kind of let it be like a little bit rounder. And so again, just to like review, so like really generally speaking, the center of your eye is usually where your arch is. Mine's a little bit off. And then usually like the end of your eye should line up with like the end of your eyebrow, and then you kind of want the front of your eye to kind of line up with the front of your brow. Does this work for everyone? No. And again, like we discussed in class before, eyebrows are very personal. So you may think you know what looks best on somebody, you may be right, but they may not see it that way, and you just never want to send somebody on stage or into film or photo shoot or whatever feeling uncomfortable. So you always do need to take into account the person that you're working on. And again, I really do recommend having that conversation with somebody beforehand. Like I feel like it might seem really trivial to talk to someone about what eyebrow shape they prefer, but it can be a really personal thing for people. People aren't used to filling in their eyebrows a lot of times, so they might feel a little bit weird already that they have to do it. So you always want to kind of like tread lightly with these situations. And a lot of times too, people might try to fight you on the fact that they need to fill in their brows. But on stage, even the people with the darkest brows most of the time have to put a little bit of color into them, just because you lose so much when you're under bright stage lights. And really, if you have somebody that's not believing it, or you're not convinced, if you send everybody out on stage and they don't have any makeup on, and then you look at them when they do, it is a world of a difference, right? So I usually recommend, if you really have somebody that's kind of fighting you on it, if you can do that, usually they'll understand once they see how everything looks under the lights, because not everybody is going to be able to visualize that without physically seeing it, right? And so now that we kind of have like the basic shape of it, I want to go in and I'm going to like clean it up a little bit. So to clean it up, I usually just take like whatever my like lightest eyeshadow color was, and I go back around it and I kind of like highlight around it. Some people do this with like concealer or foundation. I'm more comfortable with powders than anything else, so you'll see me using powder for that kind of thing a lot. So I'm just gonna go in and do that next. And again, it's one of those things where like my eyebrows look crazy most of the time when I put them on, and you just kind of have to go back and just kind of like blend things out once you get everything on there, because really until you have something on the face, you can't really see what it actually looks like. So again, so we're gonna leave this brow like a little bit more natural, just because again, for the 40s it is a little bit more of like a natural look. It was the 50s where things like really started to get more defined. Without totally covering my eyebrows, there's only so much I can do to change the shape of them. And again, for stage, most of the time people are just going to fill them in. They're not necessarily going to shape them to how they should look for the period. So for the 1950s, that's where you see people that kind of have this like more defined, like dramatic, like upward movement. Again, I don't know how much my eyebrows are going to do that, but I am going to try to make them just like a little bit more defined at least, just so that you can kind of see a difference between the two. We'll see how different I can actually get them to be. But again, even for this one, I'm still going to start in the center to fill it in, and then I like to fill out the ends next, and then I go back and I do the front. And so for this one, since I'm trying to get a little bit more definition, I'm going to try to look at it a little bit closer up, right? And so I'm going to try to like pull this end, and it's going to look a little crazy probably until I go back in, blend it out, but just to make it look a little bit more true to period, I'll try to make it a little bit more defined. And remember, even if you aren't doing 2 different time periods on your face, your eyebrows should not look exactly the same, right? They're not supposed to be identical. They're not twins, they're cousins or sisters, whatever it is that you want to say. I think a lot of times people try to make their eyebrows look totally exactly the same, but they're really not supposed to be. Your eyes aren't shaped the same. Most people, like, our faces are not symmetrical, so it's one of those things that you really don't want to get, like, too hung up on, right? So obviously I'm trying to intentionally make mine look a little bit different, but even if that is not your intention, you still don't want to be too worried about trying to make them look exactly the same. So I'm going to try to get my arch to be like a little bit more dramatic on this side. And so to do that, so my eyebrows don't actually go up that high, so I'm going to draw that in a little bit more than I normally would. And then I'm just going to go through and I'm going to blend it out just like I did my other eyebrow. Again, you can take like that same light color and do that. And then I find that if you're using like a creamy enough pencil, you can usually just go in and kind of like sharpen any of those lines that might get a little bit too blurred out or blended out. But that's why I really like to work with powders, just because I feel like it just kind of sits on top of the skin since the rest of my skin is powdered, and it's not kind of like liquidy and moving around everywhere, which I feel like kind of happens if you are working with concealers and foundations to do that kind of a thing. So I know they don't look super different, but that one's like a little bit more rounded, right? And then this one definitely has more of like an intense arch to it. It angles out a little bit, not as much as you'll see in some of the research photos for it, but it certainly does do it a little bit. So now that the brows are done, we're going to be able to move on to eyeliner.